you go back and you look at a guy like Don Jardine, who was the spoiler in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s. The spoiler was, to me, one of the greatest masked men I ever witnessed.
Well, see, the first, who was the first? Do you recall that
The
you
first
saw?
that I did,
Yeah, that you saw.
the first I ever saw was the Infernos.
Okay, and
First I
then
ever saw was the Infernos, and then probably El Santo, and then the spoiler.
okay,
And the spoiler was this big masked, just huge man that worked in Texas with Gary Hart as his manager, had the claw, which is why he wore the big black glove. But it was his work was so unique. The way that he could walk the ropes, he was so smooth. He worked like a man probably 100 pounds less in size. He was so smooth in everything he did, and everything he did was believable. I had the privilege of working with him as a referee later years in Texas, and the way that he controlled the ring, he put every single person in that ring in their place. He called everybody's moves, everybody's everything. He would tell me exactly where to stand, how to stand, and why I'm standing, what to ask. I just learned so much from him that he was a legend to me, and to me, one of the nicest guys in the world. To a lot of other people, one of the moodiest, just crabbiest, nasty people they ever met. So he had those two sides, but if you didn't get on his wrong side, he was a gentleman and one of the best workers I've ever seen in my life. But he would, as soon as he would get in the dressing room, the mask came off. He was Don Jardine then, and didn't mind people. They didn't. Hey, spoiler. He was Don then. Now, don't call him Don when he's wearing that mask, but he was able to separate the two in the dressing room. He didn't have to be the spoiler all the time. And the thing that really freaked me out and bothered me for a long time, as a matter of fact, I brought it up years later, but when the spoiler went to New York had a law that they did not allow masked wrestlers to perform. So one of the great masked wrestlers from California, El Olympico, came into New York. Couldn't wear his mask. So he wore like a aviator's cap. So his face showed, but he was still Olympico. Jardine goes there and they say, yeah, you can't wear the mask. He goes, but I'm a spoiler. I'm the spoiler with the mask. So you can't wear the mask. So he just went and worked without the mask as the spoiler. And, it was to the folks in New York, the spoiler was this guy with the long brown hair and brown beard. And that just pissed me off as a kid, seeing that in the magazines as a spoiler. And I don't know why, but it was just wasn't right, damn it. Just wasn't right. And,
let's talk about Jardine for a minute, because if you take a look at, like, when Mark Calloway first went to Texas, as I understand it, they put him under a hood, called him Texas Red, gave him a manager, but he too is another big guy wearing a mask, and he too would start walking the top rope just like Jardine. How big of an influence do you think Jardine was on the Undertaker?
I think he had seen him and really appreciated his agility and athleticism. But I always thought, I kind of thought maybe that Don had trained Taker, which he did not. He didn't at all. But Taker was able to emulate that style, and as a big man, work like a cat and be super smooth and believable in everything that he does. So yes, it had an influence on him, but that was something that Mark put into his repertoire, and I think it did well for him. I think it did well for both of them, because it's impressive to see a big man like that move the way that both of them moved. And Jardine was, man, he was just fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
As I understand it, in Lucha Libre, the mask was first founded in EMLL from an American wrestler named Cyclone McKee, who was working in Texas. And I think most people assume that, and I would have too, that masked wrestling really started in Mexico, but I guess it started in America and we took it to Mexico. So maybe it's not based off of some Aztec or Inca or Mayan tradition. Um, but what I know is it's entertained us all. And you have to look no further when I think of modern wrestling with a mask. And there's lots of different masked wrestlers, and we're going to talk about a lot of them, guys like Kane and others. But Rey Mysterio was really the first luchador during the Attitude Era to get mainstream attention here in America. And that happened, man, decades after Mil Mascaras and El Santo and all these other names had been a part of the territory system here. What was your first impression of Rey Mysterio and him performing with a mask in front of an American audience? Were you surprised that that caught on the way it did?
Well, you look at it and you mentioned Mascaras' name because Mascaras was the first masked wrestler to ever work New York with the mask. They made the exception for Mascaras. And Mascaras broke that wall down because there was such a demand for Mil Mascaras, and he came in and they thought, well, this is kind of stupid. Okay, we'll lift the mask ban. We're still going to get our 5% tax, by God, on the athletic commissions. Yeah, it was a silly rule. They didn't allow women either. And Moolah broke that wall down. So Mascaras was the first talent to really cross over in the American market and be able to go from New York to Texas to Florida, California, and be a huge star in the States. So Mascaras was that guy, but it was a different style. Mascaras could adapt his style to everybody else's. So Mascaras worked a Western style. He worked that, U.S. style. He could go over and work in Japan. And when it came time to do jobs, it was the only time that he forgot the English that he had learned as well and only knew 2 words, no job. So it was, he was a big influence on lucha libre in general, but also crossing over the States.